I knew something was terribly wrong the moment I saw a family handing over $20 bills just to reach the waterfall my grandfather had left me. At first, I honestly believed I had driven into the wrong place. The gravel parking lot was packed with pickup trucks, SUVs, and motorcycles wearing license plates from 3 different states. Bright wooden signs pointed visitors toward Crystal Falls Adventure, and a woman wearing a matching polo shirt smiled as she accepted cash from people standing in line. Children laughed, cameras flashed, and everyone acted like they were entering a public park instead of private property. I sat behind the wheel of my truck for nearly a minute, staring through the windshield while trying to understand what I was looking at. My name is Grant Walker, and only 2 weeks earlier I had inherited 4,800 acres from my grandfather, including every inch of the mountain, the forest trails, and the waterfall that had been in our family for nearly 90 years. I had spent most of my adult life working as a civil engineer in Colorado, returning only for holidays, and after my grandfather passed away, I decided it was finally time to move back home permanently. I expected fallen fences, overgrown trails, and maybe a few repairs. I never imagined I would arrive to find strangers charging admission to my own land. I climbed out of my truck without saying a word and followed the crowd toward the entrance. A teenager wearing a volunteer badge stepped in front of me with a practiced smile. "Admission is $20 per adult," he said politely. I smiled back and asked, "Who owns this place?" Without hesitation, he answered, "The HOA does. They've managed it for years." I almost laughed because I knew that wasn't true. There wasn't a single HOA anywhere on my grandfather's deed. The nearest subdivision sat almost a mile away on the opposite side of the valley. Still, I kept my expression calm. "Can I pay with cash?" I asked. The teenager nodded, and I handed him a 20 just to see what would happen next. He gave me a printed ticket with the HOA logo stamped across the bottom and pointed me toward the trail. As I walked through the trees, I noticed freshly painted signs claiming the waterfall was maintained by the Homeowners Association. There were donation boxes, branded trash cans, picnic tables, and even a small gift stand selling bottled water and t-shirts with pictures of the falls. Every improvement looked professional, which made the entire situation even stranger. Someone had invested serious money into turning my family's waterfall into a tourist attraction. The deeper I walked into the property, the more confused I became. Visitors believed they were enjoying a community attraction, employees acted like they belonged there, and nobody questioned who actually owned the land beneath their feet. When I finally reached the waterfall, I stopped exactly where my grandfather used to stand with me when I was 10 years old. The sound of rushing water instantly brought back memories of fishing together, clearing fallen branches after storms, and listening to him tell stories about how his father had protected this valley during difficult times. Standing there surrounded by tourists taking selfies, I realized none of them had any idea they were standing inside someone's private inheritance. Then I heard an unmistakable voice behind me. "Looks like another satisfied customer," a woman announced confidently. I turned around and immediately recognized Patricia Holloway from old newspaper photos. She was impossible to miss, dressed in an expensive designer outfit covered with oversized jewelry that sparkled in the afternoon sun, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who expected every conversation to end in her favor. She smiled politely at me without recognizing who I was. "Beautiful place, isn't it?" she asked proudly. I nodded and looked back at the waterfall before answering as calmly as I could. "It really is. Tell me something. Who gave your HOA permission to sell tickets to my property?" Patricia's smile did not disappear for even a second. Instead, she looked me up and down as though I were simply another tourist asking too many questions. "Your property?" she repeated with a small laugh. "That is a common misunderstanding around here." She folded her designer sunglasses and clipped them onto the front of her bright jacket before pointing toward the parking lot. "Our homeowners association has maintained this attraction for years. Without us, nobody would even know this waterfall existed." I glanced around at the visitors enjoying the view, careful not to reveal anything. "Interesting," I replied. "So the HOA owns all of this?" She confidently shook her head. "Ownership is not always the important part. Stewardship is what matters. We invested in the trails, the signs, the advertising, and the visitor experience. We made this place valuable." Her answer immediately caught my attention because she had avoided the question entirely. I had spent enough years negotiating construction contracts to recognize when someone intentionally changed the subject. "So who owns the land?" I asked again. Patricia smiled even wider. "That is a legal matter, and our attorneys have already handled everything." Those words were delivered with complete confidence, yet she never mentioned a deed, a survey, or any specific document. Instead, she reached into her handbag and handed me a glossy brochure filled with photographs of the waterfall, hiking trails, picnic areas, and smiling families. Every page displayed the HOA logo across the bottom. According to the brochure, admission fees funded maintenance, landscaping, community improvements, and environmental preservation. It looked professional enough that any visitor would naturally assume the organization had every legal right to operate there. I thanked her, folded the brochure, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. "Well," I said casually, "it certainly looks successful." Patricia nodded proudly. "We had over 12,000 visitors last year. This season should be even better." That number surprised me more than anything else she had said. Even with conservative estimates, the revenue generated by admission alone would be substantial. Yet none of that income had ever appeared in my grandfather's records. Before I could ask another question, Patricia excused herself to greet a tour group arriving from a nearby charter bus. I quietly walked away, pretending to admire the scenery while observing everything around me. Near the trail entrance, I noticed portable payment terminals processing credit cards. Employees wore matching uniforms. A small storage building contained maintenance equipment, folding chairs, and boxes of merchandise. Nothing about the operation looked temporary. Someone had built a complete business on land that my family had owned for generations. Instead of confronting anyone else, I left the property and drove directly to the county recorder's office. The clerk greeted me politely when I introduced myself and requested copies of my grandfather's recorded property documents. Within half an hour, she placed several certified records on the counter. Every legal description matched what I already believed. The waterfall, the surrounding cliffs, the parking area, and even the hiking trail all fell well inside my family's boundary lines. There was no recorded easement granting public access. There was no transfer of ownership. There was no lease to any homeowners association. There was nothing suggesting the HOA possessed any legal interest whatsoever. Before leaving, I asked one more question. "Has anyone filed recent boundary adjustments involving this property?" The clerk searched the system again and slowly shook her head. "No, sir. According to county records, the Walker family has continuously owned this land." Hearing those words confirmed my instincts, but they also created an even bigger mystery. If the paperwork had never changed, how had an entire business been operating here without anyone questioning it? As I walked back toward my truck, an older surveyor leaving the office recognized my last name. "You must be Harold Walker's grandson," he said with a friendly smile. I introduced myself, and his expression became thoughtful. "Your grandfather came in here several times over the years asking questions about increased traffic near the waterfall. He always planned to deal with it later." I asked if he knew anything else. The surveyor paused before answering quietly. "He told me he believed somebody was slowly convincing people the land belonged to the subdivision. He just never expected it to grow this large." I thanked him, climbed into my truck, and looked once more at the admission ticket still resting on the passenger seat. That small piece of paper suddenly felt much more important than $20. It was not just a receipt. It was proof that someone had openly charged the public to enter private property. And for the first time since returning home, I stopped thinking about how to ask questions. I started thinking about how to collect answers. I resisted every temptation to confront Patricia again because I had already learned something valuable during my years as an engineer. The loudest argument rarely won. The best documentation almost always did. Instead of announcing that I was the property owner, I spent the next several days acting like an ordinary visitor while quietly gathering information. Every morning I parked outside the entrance before the ticket booth opened. Every afternoon I watched families arrive in steady waves. By sunset, I had filled an entire notebook with observations about employee schedules, admission prices, merchandise sales, guided tours, and parking traffic. The operation was far larger than I had first imagined. There were electronic payment terminals, online reservations, souvenir sales, food vendors on weekends, and even photographers offering printed pictures beside the waterfall. Every part of the business appeared organized, profitable, and surprisingly polished. What puzzled me most was how comfortable everyone seemed. Employees greeted repeat visitors by name. Local businesses promoted the attraction in brochures. Even nearby hotels displayed flyers encouraging tourists to spend a day at the falls. Somewhere along the way, everyone had accepted the idea that the homeowners association legitimately controlled the property. That assumption had become more powerful than the actual legal records. On the fourth morning, I stopped at a small diner just outside town where my grandfather used to eat breakfast every Friday. The waitress recognized my last name almost immediately. Within minutes, several longtime residents walked over to welcome me home. I casually mentioned that I had visited the Waterfall and asked how long the Homeowners Association had been operating there. The answers were remarkably consistent. Most people believed it had been at least 6 or 7 years. One retired teacher laughed and said she had purchased annual passes for her grandchildren several summers in a row because she thought the money supported trail maintenance. Another customer mentioned hearing that admission revenue funded neighborhood improvements inside the subdivision. None of them sounded angry. They genuinely believed they were supporting a community project. That conversation changed my perspective. This was no longer simply about someone using my land. Hundreds of honest people had likely been paying money under assumptions they had never questioned. Later that afternoon, I visited a local print shop after noticing its logo on one of the Waterfall brochures Patricia had handed me. The owner greeted me warmly and proudly explained that his company had printed promotional materials for the attraction for years. I asked whether business had been good. He smiled. They always pay on time. Patricia runs a tight operation. I thanked him and left without revealing who I was. Every conversation seemed to reinforce the same pattern. People trusted Patricia because she acted with complete confidence. Confidence had gradually become credibility. The following day brought the first unexpected break. As I photographed the entrance from a public road, a man in his early 60s approached me. He introduced himself as Daniel Pierce and quietly asked whether I was investigating the Homeowners Association. I hesitated before answering, but something about his expression convinced me to be honest. I inherited this property, I told him softly. His eyes widened, and he looked around before speaking again. Then you need to know something. I used to serve on the HOA Finance Committee. He explained that he had resigned 3 years earlier after questioning how tourism revenue was being reported during board meetings. According to him, members were always shown summaries instead of complete financial statements. Whenever detailed questions were raised, Patricia insisted everything had already been reviewed by professionals. Daniel admitted he had never found proof of wrongdoing, but he also never received direct answers. Before leaving, he reached into the back seat of his truck and handed me a worn folder filled with meeting agendas, newsletters, and public budget reports that he had kept after resigning. These are only copies, he said, but you might notice things I missed. I thanked him sincerely and drove home before opening the folder. As evening settled over the valley, I spread every document across my grandfather's old dining table. Most pages appeared ordinary until I reached several annual reports celebrating record tourism income without listing exact revenue figures or detailed expenses. The language sounded impressive, yet the numbers remained strangely vague. Then I noticed something even more interesting. Every report referenced an outside accounting review, but none identified the accounting firm. I leaned back in my chair and looked through the window toward the distant outline of the mountain where the waterfall waited in the fading light. For the first time since returning home, I realized this situation was much larger than a simple property dispute. Someone had spent years building a story that everyone believed, and I had just found the first loose thread that might unravel all of it. The next morning, I drove to the office of a licensed land surveying company that had worked throughout the county for decades. Instead of asking for opinions, I asked for facts. I placed my grandfather's deed, the certified county records, and several historic aerial photographs on the conference table. The lead surveyor studied each document carefully before looking at me. If these records are accurate, he said, tracing a finger across the legal description, the waterfall, the trail, the parking area, and even the ticket booth all appear to be inside your property boundaries. I nodded because that matched everything I had already discovered. I want a completely new survey, I replied. I want every boundary verified with modern equipment. He smiled slightly. That is the right approach. 2 days later, their crew arrived with GPS receivers, robotic total stations, historical plats, and county benchmark data. I stayed out of their way while they worked from sunrise until late afternoon. They measured old stone markers my great-grandfather had referenced, located iron pins buried beneath years of soil, and compared every measurement against official county coordinates. Watching them work reminded me of my engineering career. There was no guessing, no assumptions, only measurable facts. By the end of the second day, the lead surveyor invited me to review the preliminary map inside his truck. A thick red boundary line surrounded the entire Waterfall property. The parking lot sat well inside that line. The entrance gate stood inside it. The souvenir stand, picnic area, and every section of the hiking trail used by paying visitors were all located on my family's land. Even more surprising, the subdivision entrance stopped nearly 800 feet away from the nearest property corner. There was no overlap, no shared parcel, and no recorded public access corridor. There is nothing ambiguous here, the surveyor explained. Your ownership is very clear. I thanked him and requested certified copies as soon as the final drawings were completed. Before leaving, he handed me one piece of advice. Do not confront anyone until your attorney reviews everything. Documentation is strongest when nobody can claim it was influenced after the fact. His words matched exactly what I had already been thinking. That afternoon, I returned to the Waterfall, once again blending into the crowd as another paying visitor. Business seemed even busier than before. A wedding photographer was arranging pictures beside the falls while a guide led another group along the trail, proudly explaining that admission fees help preserve the natural beauty of the property. I quietly listened without interrupting. Every statement sounded polished and rehearsed. Near the gift stand, I noticed something new that immediately caught my attention. A large framed display thanked several local businesses for sponsoring improvements to the attraction. Underneath each business name appeared the phrase, "In partnership with the Homeowners Association." If those companies believed they were funding legitimate improvements on HOA property, they might also possess contracts, invoices, or correspondence that could become important later. I took several photographs from public areas and continued walking. Just before leaving, I saw Patricia greeting a television reporter from a small regional news station. She confidently described the Waterfall as one of the association's greatest accomplishments and proudly discussed future expansion plans that included additional parking and new observation decks. I watched the interview from a distance without saying a single word. Every confident sentence she spoke was being recorded, preserved, and broadcast. She believed public attention strengthened her position. I began to realize it might actually do the opposite. As I drove home with the completed survey resting safely inside a protective tube beside me, I no longer wondered whether the land belonged to my family. That question had already been answered. The real question had become much larger. How had an entire organization managed to convince an entire community that a private waterfall had somehow become theirs? And how many written records had they created while telling that story? By the end of that week, I finally met with an attorney instead of relying only on my own conclusions. I carried a thick binder containing the certified property records, the completed land survey, photographs of the admission booth, copies of brochures, the ticket I had purchased, Daniel Pierce's documents, and notes from every conversation I had recorded immediately afterward. My attorney, Melissa Carter, spent nearly 2 hours reviewing everything without interruption. When she finally closed the binder, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "You have something many property disputes never have," she said. "A timeline supported by documents instead of assumptions." I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind ever since I returned home. Should I send a demand letter today? She shook her head almost immediately. "Not yet." I looked at her in surprise. She pointed toward the survey map. "Your ownership is already well documented. The stronger opportunity now is to understand the full scope of what has been happening before we interrupt it." At first her advice seemed strange, but then she explained her reasoning. If the operation stopped immediately, important records could disappear, contracts might quietly change, and people would suddenly become careful about what they said. If the business continued operating normally for a little longer, everything would remain exactly as it had been for years. Every ticket sold, every advertisement published, every public statement, and every scheduled event would continue creating an independent record. The organization believed it had nothing to hide, and confidence often produced the best evidence. I agreed with the strategy. Rather than confronting Patricia, we decided to quietly preserve everything exactly as it existed. Over the next several days, I installed several security cameras on sections of my property that clearly faced only my own land and complied with local requirements. Their purpose was simple. They documented vehicle traffic, visitor counts, and business activity occurring on my property without interfering with anyone. Melissa also recommended hiring a licensed forensic accountant to review every publicly available financial filing connected to the homeowners association. We may not have access to private records yet, she explained, but public filings often tell their own story. Meanwhile, I continued visiting the Waterfall as an ordinary guest. Employees had begun recognizing my face, although nobody suspected who I actually was. One young worker cheerfully told me they expected their biggest weekend of the year because Patricia had organized a community festival featuring local food vendors, live acoustic music, guided nature walks, and expanded visiting hours. He sounded genuinely excited and proud of his job. I thanked him and wished him luck because I understood he was simply doing the work he had been hired to do. My concern had never been with the employees or the visitors. It centered entirely on whoever had created the false impression that private property belonged to the homeowners association. 2 days before the festival, another unexpected opportunity appeared. A local landscaping company delivered several truckloads of decorative stone near the entrance. Curious, I introduced myself to the foreman and casually asked whether they had worked there often. He replied that they had maintained the grounds for several seasons under annual contracts approved directly by Patricia. He even mentioned that another improvement project was scheduled after the festival to expand the viewing area. Once again, I simply thanked him and walked away. Every conversation added another piece to the larger picture without requiring confrontation. That evening, Melissa called with encouraging news. The forensic accountant had already identified several publicly available reports that deserved closer examination, particularly because certain tourism activities appeared much larger than the financial summaries distributed to association members. We agreed not to jump to conclusions until every document had been verified. As the call ended, I looked across the valley toward the distant lights surrounding the waterfall. The upcoming festival was only days away, and Patricia believed it would become the association's greatest public success. She had no idea that every advertisement, every receipt, every scheduled activity, and every confident announcement was quietly becoming part of a much larger record that neither she nor anyone else could easily erase. The morning of the festival arrived with clear skies and cool mountain air, exactly the kind of weather that encouraged people to spend an entire day outdoors. Before sunrise, I drove to a public overlook nearly half a mile from the waterfall where I could watch traffic without interfering with anyone. By 7 o'clock, vehicles were already lining the entrance road. Families carried folding chairs, hikers unloaded backpacks, and food vendors prepared their booths for what Patricia had advertised as the largest community celebration in the history of the attraction. Everything unfolded exactly as the promotional materials had promised. Volunteers directed parking, musicians tested their sound equipment, and employees scanned admission tickets with handheld devices while welcoming hundreds of visitors. The operation looked less like a neighborhood event and more like a professionally managed destination. I quietly photographed the entrance from public locations, recording the steady flow of visitors while my security cameras documented activity from my own property. Shortly after 8 o'clock, Melissa called to let me know that every document we had requested was now organized and reviewed. She reminded me of the plan we had agreed upon. "Today is not about confrontation," she said calmly. "Today is about allowing public agencies to independently observe exactly what has been happening." Within the hour, representatives from the County Business Licensing Office, the local Tax Compliance Division, and the Parks and Environmental Permitting Department arrived separately, each responding to requests that had been submitted through normal administrative channels weeks earlier. None of them came with dramatic announcements. They simply introduced themselves, identified their departments, and asked routine questions about permits, commercial activity, and operational records. From where I stood, I could see Patricia greet each official with the same confident smile she always displayed. At first, she appeared completely relaxed. She walked them toward the information tent while explaining how much the association had done for the community. Visitors continued entering without realizing anything unusual was happening. Music still played, Children still laughed near the picnic area, and guided tours continued, leaving every 30 minutes. Nearly an hour passed before I noticed the first subtle change. One official requested additional paperwork. Another began photographing signs near the admission booth. A third carefully measured the dimensions of temporary vendor spaces while comparing information on a clipboard. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody accused anyone of wrongdoing. They simply continued documenting what they observed. Around midday, several local business owners who had sponsored festival activities arrived expecting to enjoy the celebration. Instead, they found county representatives asking polite questions about sponsorship agreements, promotional materials, and contracts connected to the event. I recognized the landscaping foreman I had spoken with earlier in the week. He willingly answered every question because he believed everything had been handled properly. Watching those conversations unfold confirmed what Melissa had predicted. Independent documentation often became stronger than any argument. During the afternoon, a regional television crew appeared after seeing the festival advertisements. Patricia eagerly welcomed them, proudly describing the attraction as another successful achievement for the Homeowners Association. While cameras recorded her interview, the county officials continued their work only a short distance away. The contrast could not have been greater. Patricia focused on public celebration while government employees quietly focused on records, permits, and documented facts. By late afternoon, I received another call from Melissa. She had just spoken with the forensic accountant, who confirmed that additional financial questions had emerged after comparing publicly available reports with the scale of the commercial activity taking place at the waterfall. "We still are not making conclusions," she reminded me. But every verified fact continues pointing in the same direction. As the sun began dropping behind the western ridge, visitors slowly headed home carrying souvenirs, photographs, and pleasant memories of the festival. Most of them had enjoyed an ordinary day and remained completely unaware of the larger story unfolding behind the scenes. Patricia stood near the entrance thanking volunteers and congratulating board members on what she proudly described as their greatest event ever. I watched from across the valley for one final moment before returning to my truck. She believed the festival had strengthened the association's position in the eyes of the public. What she did not realize was that this single day had also created the most complete independent record anyone had assembled since the Homeowners Association first began charging admission to my family's waterfall. And for the first time since inheriting the property, I felt certain that every carefully gathered piece of evidence was finally beginning to fit together. 3 days after the festival, the first signs of change appeared, and they did not come from lawyers or government offices. They came from the homeowners themselves. The association published a cheerful newsletter celebrating what Patricia proudly described as the most successful community event in its history, complete with photographs of smiling visitors standing beside the waterfall. Under normal circumstances, the newsletter probably would have ended the conversation. Instead, it started a completely different one. Residents who had attended the festival began asking simple questions during neighborhood discussions and on the community message board. Several people wanted to know why county representatives had spent so much time examining permits and taking photographs. Others wondered why multiple agencies had requested business records during what was supposed to be nothing more than a community celebration. At first, Patricia dismissed every concern with the same confidence she had shown from the beginning. She assured everyone that routine inspections happened all the time and insisted there was absolutely nothing to worry about. Her explanation sounded convincing until more people started comparing notes. One business owner mentioned that officials had asked detailed questions about sponsorship agreements. Another resident recalled hearing discussions about property records rather than landscaping. A volunteer quietly admitted that employees had suddenly been instructed not to answer questions from anyone outside the association. None of those conversations proved wrongdoing by themselves, but together they created something Patricia had not anticipated: doubt. That same afternoon, Daniel Pierce called and asked if I had heard about the emergency board meeting scheduled for the following evening. According to several current residents, Patricia had announced the meeting only a few hours earlier and planned to discuss confidential legal matters with the board. I thanked Daniel for letting me know and immediately informed Melissa. She simply replied, "That tells us the pressure is beginning to work." We still refused to rush ahead. Every decision remained deliberate. Every document continued being organized in chronological order. Every photograph, receipt, survey record, brochure, interview, and observation was cataloged exactly as it had been collected. The stronger our evidence became, the less emotion we needed. The following morning, another interesting development unfolded. A local newspaper published a short article covering the successful festival. The story included one photograph of Patricia smiling beside the waterfall while thanking volunteers for their dedication. It also briefly mentioned that several county departments had attended the event as part of routine administrative reviews. That single sentence attracted far more attention than the festival itself. By lunchtime, dozens of online comments questioned what those reviews actually involved. People were not making accusations. They were simply asking for clarification. Meanwhile, I received an unexpected visitor at my ranch. The owner of the small print shop I had visited earlier arrived carrying a cardboard box. He looked uncomfortable as he introduced himself again. After reading the newspaper, he said, "I started thinking about something." Inside the box were archived design proofs, invoices, and promotional drafts his company had created for the waterfall over several years. "These are our copies," he explained. "If they help clear things up, you should have them." I thanked him sincerely because I understood what he was doing. He was not choosing sides. He simply wanted the facts to be accurate. As I reviewed the documents later that afternoon, I noticed a pattern that immediately stood out. Earlier brochures had described the waterfall as being managed by the community. Later versions gradually changed the wording to owned and operated. The shift had happened slowly over several seasons, almost so gradually that most readers would never notice. Melissa found that detail fascinating. "Language matters," she said during our evening meeting. "When wording changes over time, it sometimes reveals how a public narrative evolves." That observation stayed with me. Nobody had woken up one morning believing the homeowners association owned my family's waterfall. The idea had been introduced little by little until it eventually sounded normal. Before sunset, Daniel called again with another update from inside the neighborhood. The emergency board meeting had not gone well. Several homeowners reportedly demanded complete financial reports connected to tourism revenue. Others wanted copies of any legal documents proving the association's authority over the waterfall property. Patricia had promised to provide answers later, but according to Daniel, many residents left more concerned than when they arrived. As darkness settled across the valley, I stood on the porch of my grandfather's house looking toward the distant mountain where the waterfall continued flowing exactly as it had for generations. The water had never changed. The land had never moved. The official property records had remained the same for decades. The only thing that had changed was the story people had been told, and for the first time, that story was beginning to unravel on its own. 1 week after the festival, Melissa called before sunrise and asked me to meet her at the county administration building. Her voice sounded calm, which usually meant something important had finally reached the point where speculation could be replaced with documented facts. When I arrived, she already had several binders arranged neatly across a conference table. Beside them sat the certified land survey, county property records, archived promotional brochures, photographs collected over the previous weeks, and chronological summaries prepared by the forensic accountant. None of the evidence depended on assumptions. Every page had a date, a source, or an official certification attached to it. "Today," Melissa said quietly, "we stop asking what happened. Today we simply demonstrate what can already be verified." Representatives from several county departments attended the meeting, each bringing records gathered independently during the festival and the days that followed. One department presented photographs documenting commercial activity on the property. Another produced copies of publicly available business filings. The property office confirmed the legal ownership history without interruption or disagreement. The survey company explained exactly how the modern measurements aligned with historic boundary markers dating back decades. Each presentation reinforced the previous one. Nobody argued. Nobody needed dramatic speeches. Every verified document naturally connected to the next. Later that afternoon, the Homeowners Association appeared through legal counsel along with Patricia and several board members. Patricia entered the room carrying herself with the same confidence I had seen since the day we first met beside the waterfall. She greeted people politely and smiled as though she expected another routine discussion. That confidence lasted until the certified survey map was projected onto the screen. The lead surveyor carefully explained every boundary using county coordinates, historical monuments, and recorded deeds. He highlighted the waterfall, the admission booth, the parking area, the gift stand, and every section of the hiking trail. One by one, each location appeared entirely inside my family's property lines. There was no overlap with subdivision property. There was no recorded easement granting commercial access. There was no transfer of ownership. When the presentation ended, the room remained unusually quiet because there was very little left to debate regarding where the property actually existed. Melissa then introduced the chronological evidence we had assembled. First came the certified deeds. Next came the admission ticket I had personally purchased. After that appeared dated photographs showing commercial operations, brochures describing the attraction, archived promotional materials from different years, publicly distributed newsletters, sponsorship documents voluntarily provided by local businesses, and statements collected from individuals who had participated in the operation believing everything had been handled properly. The most striking moment arrived when the print shop owner explained how promotional language had gradually changed over several seasons from describing the waterfall as a community destination to describing it as association property. He answered every question honestly and without exaggeration. He simply explained what his archive files showed. The forensic accountant followed with a careful summary of publicly available financial information, making it clear that his review identified areas requiring further clarification rather than offering accusations. His professionalism strengthened the credibility of every other document in the room. Patricia's attorney responded by emphasizing the association's investment in maintaining trails, installing signs, organizing events, and improving visitor experiences. Melissa immediately agreed that those activities may indeed have occurred. Then she calmly asked a single question. Can you identify the recorded legal document authorizing commercial operations on Mr. Walker's property? Several moments passed while files were reviewed. Additional binders were opened. Quiet conversations took place between Patricia and the association's attorney. Eventually, the attorney acknowledged that no recorded deed, easement, lease, or written property agreement had been produced during the meeting. That answer changed the atmosphere more than any argument could have. Even several board members appeared surprised. They had apparently believed such documentation already existed. Patricia looked genuinely unsettled for the first time since I had returned home. She insisted the association had always acted in good faith because previous leadership assured everyone the arrangements were legitimate. Melissa did not challenge her personally. Instead, she returned to the certified county records displayed on the screen. Intentions may be discussed later, she said respectfully. Ownership is already established by the public record. As the meeting concluded, county representatives outlined the next administrative and legal steps that would follow, while encouraging all parties to preserve records and cooperate fully. Walking out of the building that afternoon, I realized something important. I had not won because I argued more loudly than anyone else. I had reached this moment because every fact had been collected patiently, verified independently, and presented in an order that allowed the truth to explain itself. The weeks that followed were surprisingly quiet, and after everything that had happened, that silence felt almost unfamiliar. Administrative reviews continued through the normal legal process, records remained preserved, and every party cooperated with the requests that had been outlined during the county meeting. Eventually, the final agreements confirmed what the certified deeds and surveys had shown from the very beginning. My family retained exclusive ownership of the waterfall, the surrounding forest, the parking area, and every trail located within our property boundaries. Commercial admission under the Homeowners Association came to an end, and future access arrangements would now be handled directly through lawful agreements that respected both private property rights and local regulations. What impressed me most was not the paperwork itself, but how people responded once the facts became public. Many residents from the subdivision stopped by my ranch over the following weeks, not to argue, but to apologize for believing information they had accepted for years without ever seeing the official records. I never blamed them. Most had simply trusted what they had been told. Several volunteers who had worked at the entrance admitted they honestly believed they were supporting a community project. The local business owners who had sponsored improvements expressed relief that the situation had finally been clarified because they wanted their contributions to benefit the community in transparent and appropriate ways. Even Daniel Pierce smiled when we met for coffee one morning. "I spent years wondering whether something felt wrong," he said. "Now I finally understand why." Patricia was no longer the confident public face she had been when I first arrived. During one of the final community meetings, she acknowledged that serious mistakes had been made and announced that she would no longer serve as president of the association. A new board committed itself to improving transparency, publishing complete financial summaries, and verifying major decisions through proper legal review before moving forward. Watching those changes unfold reminded me that organizations are ultimately built by people, and people can choose to learn from difficult situations. As for me, I spent the following months restoring the property in a way that honored my grandfather's vision. The unnecessary commercial signs disappeared. The oversized admission booth was removed. The forest trails were repaired using environmentally responsible methods, and local conservation groups helped develop educational markers explaining the natural history of the valley instead of promoting private organizations. Rather than turning the waterfall into an exclusive attraction, I worked with county officials to establish scheduled public visiting days through lawful agreements that respected both private ownership and environmental protection. Families could once again enjoy the beauty of the falls without confusion about who owned the land or where their support was going. One afternoon, I stood beside the same overlook where my grandfather had once taught me how to skip stones across the water. The waterfall sounded exactly as it had during my childhood. It did not care about meetings, brochures, headlines, or arguments. It simply continued flowing through the valley, unchanged by the stories people created around it. That was the lesson I carried away from the entire experience. Facts do not become less true simply because they are repeated less often than assumptions. Real ownership is established through records, responsibility, and respect, not confidence or popularity. Looking back, I realized I never won because I raised my voice. I succeeded because I stayed patient long enough to let verified evidence tell the story for me. If I had confronted everyone on the first day, I might never have uncovered how the misunderstanding had grown over the years. By waiting, documenting, and following the proper process, the truth became impossible to ignore. Now I would love to hear your thoughts. If you discovered someone was operating a business on your private property while claiming it belonged to someone else, what would you have done in my situation? Share your opinion in the comments because I genuinely enjoy reading your perspectives. And if you enjoy stories where patience, preparation, and documented facts make all the difference, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next journey. Thank you for spending your time with me. And until next time, take care of the people you value, protect what matters, and never underestimate the power of the truth.